And yet, here's the interesting thing. Despite the fact that what happened was clearly inevitable from, say 95, 96, at the very latest, classified advertising revenues in newspapers did not peak until 2006. That's to say they peaked in 2006 and then they started to fall off a cliff. So what that tells you is that often, you can see a trend which is, really inevitable or inexorable, but it will take quite a long time for it to become realized.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 114 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they used to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have the former Prime Minister of Australia and active investor Malcolm Turnbull as my guest for this episode. Most of you listening will be quite familiar with his background in politics, particularly as the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. But prior to this, he had quite a successful career as a serial entrepreneur and investor, including a $500,000 investment into Aussie Mail that resulted in a $57 million exit. Since leaving politics, Malcolm has jumped back into business and is actively investing into Australian tech startups such as Myriota, advanced navigation, and safety culture. We covered a range of topics in this interview, including the importance of timing when it comes to successful ventures, how to retain conviction, how to build long-term trust and credibility with key stakeholders, the importance of founder mental health, and the future of Australian tech. Without further ado, here is my interview with Malcolm Turnbull. Hi everyone, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. Delighted to have Malcolm Turnbull on as our guest for this episode, but before we get into the interview, just wanted to do a quick rundown, especially for those of you that are joining us for the first time, about the format of this podcast and how the session will work. So for the first 45 minutes or so, we'll do a one-on-one interview as per normal. And then for the remaining time, we'll shift gears and jump into audience Q&A as well. Thank you to all of you that have already submitted questions via the registration process. If you have any questions that come up while we're interviewing, you can submit them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible, especially those topics that we haven't covered in the interview as well. And finally, before we start, for those of you playing along at home, the hashtag for the event is #PlaybookLive. With that out of the way, Malcolm, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thank you for taking time to join us this morning.
Well, thanks very much, Rohit. Great to be with you and with your guests or our guests.
So Malcolm, I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and say the majority of the people that are tuning in are probably familiar with your political career, especially your role as the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, but people may be less aware of your background prior to politics, particularly as an entrepreneur and investor. So wondering, for the benefit of those listening at home, if you could share what some of your experiences were, particularly as an entrepreneur and investor growing up.
Over the years, mostly with Lucy, I've started or co-started or support. I've founded or co-founded probably a dozen businesses over the years. I haven't ever added them all up, and that not least because some of them were complete flops, and I've tried to forget them. But the reality is that I've been something of a serial entrepreneur. I'm a great believer in entrepreneurship and in innovation, and made it a key part of my economic policy as Prime Minister. It's really in my DNA. I mean, I think that you have to be, in whatever line of work you're doing or whatever you're doing, you've got to be prepared to look at problems anew and see if you can find a better, smarter, more interesting way to do things. So, I found, what have I learned from entrepreneurship? Well, the first thing is you shouldn't regard a plan not, fulfilling your ambitions as being a failure. I mean, we haven't got a better word than failure, but a failure is not a failure, if you know what I mean. I mean, a failure means that, the idea you had didn't work out as you planned. That's too bad. You've learned something. hopefully you've only lost some money, and you get on and do something else. So one of the things you've got to try and do is discourage the stigmatization of failure. Because if you stigmatize failure, then people will not try anything new. And you see this in big organizations, particularly in bureaucracies. If you have a culture which says, if you do something and it doesn't work out, you'll get jumped on, then the rational actor doesn't do anything at all. And this is how you get, this often real resistance to change in big organizations, and applies to companies too. Because unless you're encouraging from the top down, unless you're encouraging the people that work there to, stretch and do something, push the envelope, confident in the knowledge that if it doesn't work, they're not going to get beaten up or, denounced or whatever. If you don't do that, then you end up really being left behind. So I think that's probably the most important lesson. It's one I took into government. It's quite hard in government, I've got to say, because the institutional culture is quite resistant to change generally.
Obviously there's so many things that I want to cover, and you've touched on a few of the sort of key points as well. And, just kind of given time constraints, I'm going to jump right into it. I often have to trawl through the internet to do my research on all of my guests, but thankfully I've had a fantastic resource to go off. It's been fascinating listening to your story, particularly around your childhood. And you just touched on, innovation was really part of your DNA growing up. And I think it's fair to say that many Australians would sort of really view you as a prime minister that really tried to push the innovation agenda through the country as well. Something that really struck out to me while listening to your audiobook for the autobiography as well was that you mentioned that your mother was a radio actress and a playwright. And she was quite successful in her career, often being the majority breadwinner, at a time where I assumed that wasn't as normal as it may be today. But you mentioned in your autobiography that, over time things shifted, particularly as businesses started to shift from advertising to radio to TV. And I'm really curious to know, how impactful was, I guess, having that experience firsthand in shaping the way that you sort of looked at innovation or technology or kind of looked at the future?
Yeah, well, mum was an actress. I mean, her parents were both actors, actually, originally. And she was an actor. So she came from a theatrical family. And a theatrical political family, actually. Often the two things go together. But anyway, I'm sure she was a good actress, but what she was really good at was writing drama. And she used to write radio serials, often 3 serials concurrently. And this was, you're right, that after television started to take over from the late 1950s, early 1960s, people stopped listening to radio serials because they were watching, Gunsmoke and Wagon Train or whatever the, latest Western was on television. And and so she moved into other areas. But look, I guess I've observed through. I wasn't so aware of those changes when I was a kid, because my mother left us when I was about 9. And so, that was really when the changes started to occur. That may well have prompted her moving into academia, and she ended up becoming a professor of English. But I'd say that, I've observed the changes in the media very closely over a long period of time. I've been involved in the media industry one way or another pretty much all my life. I'll give you one interesting sort of bit of anecdata that's worth reflecting on. So we started Aussie Mail in 1994, we being Sean Howard, who was the founder and the technical guru and wizard, and the 2 sort of financial business partners, me and Trevor Kennedy. And by the mid-90s, it was obvious that, the internet was here, it was commercial, it was growing. and there was only one way it was going to go, and that was up. It was also obvious that the mainstream media's advertising model was going to be really challenged, and first in line to be challenged was classifieds. I mean, quite clearly, if you could search online, that was clearly, for a new car or a house or whatever, that was clearly a lot better than wading through acres of newsprint. And yet, here's the interesting thing. Despite the fact that what happened was clearly inevitable from, say 95, 96, at the very latest, classified advertising revenues in newspapers did not peak until 2006. That's to say, they peaked in 2006 and then they started to fall off a cliff. So what that tells you is that often, you can see a trend which is, really inevitable or inexorable, and then, but it will take quite a long time, perhaps not so long now as it did then, for it to become realised. And yet, people were very, very slow to act. So it's very interesting, because you find, we see denialism. Denialism is sort of part of human nature, whether we're denying, we can't get your belt done up in the morning and you refuse to believe that you've put on weight, or we deny unpleasant things, and climate change being the most dangerous at the moment. But a lot of businesses, when their business model is under siege, as it were, by disruptive change, will try to deny that. And you see in the media business, there's been quite a lot of that. The transformation of media has been extraordinary, and it's had I think in many ways, very adverse political consequences too, by the way. Just because something is new doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing, but equally, most innovation ultimately is unstoppable. So it's just a question of whether you seize it and make it work for you, because it's going to be generally impossible to stop it or hold it off.
Yeah, I mean, even just within the last few days, we've seen SpaceX become the first private company to launch humans into orbit as well. And it's been really interesting seeing on social media, people pulling up old blog posts or articles, really sort of denouncing Elon Musk and the vision and mission behind SpaceX as well. And, you obviously just touched on, sometimes particular things can seem inevitable, but in the moment in time, because of different ideals or kind of different perspectives, seeing that adjustment takes a little bit of time. And obviously from a startup perspective as well, sometimes, founders especially have grand visions of what they think that the future will look like. And it can be difficult for them to retain that, especially when, potentially investors don't see that vision or customers aren't quite ready. How do you retain that conviction around your vision or mission when potentially it's a little bit too early or the market's a little bit slow to move?
Yeah, well, timing is everything. Keynes is credited with saying the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And anyone that's engaged in short selling will understand what I mean. That overvalued, incompetently managed stock with the fraudulent accounts that you've been busily shorting. If at some point you'll have to cover because the market doesn't recognize what's wrong, and then of course by the time you're broke, then the bubble bursts and the stock collapses. So that's timing is often a real challenge. Look, I think that sticking, well, Rohit, you put your finger on it. I mean, obviously, there are plenty of people with good ideas that get thwarted by timing, lack of finance, partners that aren't on board. I mean, there's one example I give in my book, right? So, which is, I think, a kind of interesting one, very interesting one. So we started Aussie Mail, as I said, in 94. We floated it in 96 on the NASDAQ because you could not raise a nickel for Australian technology on the ASX in the 90s. I mean, there was literally no interest here. You know, I used to raise money for highly speculative mining companies, you know, in far off places like Russia, which you would think would define high risk. But we couldn't raise money for Aussie Mail here. Anyway, we raised it on NASDAQ, it did well. And we had a business which Sean Howard, I should say, by the way, is one of the great Australian innovators. And what Sean had, in a way that very few people I've known have got, is he used to have, and still does, technological imagination. And he always used to say, there's always a lot of tech around, but what's scarce is the imagination, you know, working out what you can do with it. And one of the ideas he came up with was, basically internet advertising in the, you know, the technique of placing ads on web pages as they're served. So an ad serving technology, you know, as, you know, was made famous or ubiquitous by DoubleClick and then by everybody else. We actually had a company called Webwide Media, which Anthony Bettini was the chief executive of. And we decided which did exactly that. And it worked and it was all good. And we decided that it would be a good idea to have a major media partner. And we agreed with Sam Chisholm, who was then running B Sky B, which was controlled by Murdoch, that we should do it together. And so it was a 50-50 partnership. Liz Murdoch and I were the co-chairs, and off we go. And then, you know, as often happens in these big family-run businesses, there was Chisholm fell out, or there was a falling out between Chisholm and Murdoch, and Webwide Media was a casualty. And, you know, that was a few years later, DoubleClick was sold for $3 billion. So, you know, you look at that and you say, well, you know, News Corp, Murdoch, whatever, supposed to be super smart people, literally killed off a business that could not have failed to have made a huge amount of money, because it was not because it was terribly smart. Its technology was no better than DoubleClick's, but it was literally, you know, it was the right boat in the right part, in the fastest part of the river heading downstream. And so it couldn't fail to succeed. It was only question was how well it succeeded. And, you know, that was just an example of the dangers of having partners for whom your business is not that important. You know, this is always and I've seen this in a lot of other areas too. So you're a small business, you're a startup business, you get into bed with a big company and you think that's great. They're going to promote us or help us in some way or another. Unfortunately, if they lose interest, or if their focus is somewhere else, you know, if the great eye of Sauron moves on from your business onto something else, you can easily become forgotten and then often starve for capital. And I've seen that, not just in the tech sector, but elsewhere. So it's always important to make sure that you retain control of your business in the sense of being able to, maintain its direction and trajectory, because a larger partner may well just lose interest. You know, there's that old saying, same bed, different dreams. And that's often the case when you get a big business, particularly with a legacy business, getting into bed with a startup.
again, so many things there that I want to pick on, but just pulling on a thread that you just mentioned as well, so much of running a company and so much about leadership, as you mentioned, is just about setting a course of direction. And from my own experience, I know that, a founder's journey pretty much every day is having to balance between making big decisions every single day. Do they invest more in marketing? Do they increase headcount? If they focus on increasing headcount, do they hire a couple of mid and junior people, or do they go for a more senior hire as well? uh, you know, uh, every single day is about sort of balancing and trying to get those decisions right. I imagine that running a country and being prime minister is that times 1,000, 10,000. What are some of the processes that you look at when deciding how to effectively allocate resources based on the needs or based on kind of different demands of stakeholders?
Well, I mean, when you're running the Australian government, different prime ministers operate in different ways. While I'm a great believer in innovation, I operated a traditional cabinet government. There is a temptation for prime ministers to be chasing headlines. Abbott was a classic example of this, as was Rudd, frankly. Decision making is driven by the desire to, make a headline or to, make a political point. We were very conscious of the need to ensure due process, and the cabinet process can work quickly if you work hard at it. And so, allocating resources, well, that was all done through the budget process, through the expenditure review committee. New policy proposals, whether they were my idea or somebody else's, came through cabinet. There are very few decisions that I made or my government made that were sort of made by me as opposed to made by the cabinet. Now, this is not to say, this is obviously, the cabinet is generally inclined to agree with the prime minister, but there's no substitute for actually making sure that your proposal actually goes through that process so that other minds have a look at it and other voices can be heard to critique it. So, I firmly believe that the best government is one that is collective leadership, but, sadly, it's not practiced as often or as systematically as it should be over the last few decades.
Something that I think, that I personally think is critically important that doesn't get talked about enough is the need to build trust. For a founder, whether you're trying to sell your product, hire talented people to join your team or try and convince investors to give you cash, a lot of that comes down to building trust and credibility. And again, some of those things might be challenging, especially for first-time founders or someone who's relatively new and doesn't have a network in the space. One of the things that really struck out to me while reading your book was, at quite a young age, you were able to build a lot of trust and credibility with key stakeholders around you. I think you were 28 when Kerry Packer offered you the role of General Counsel and Secretary for the Australian Consolidated Press Holdings Group. Yeah. What were, again, where did I guess some of that ability or some of that skill come from, and what were some of the ways that you were able to build up that trust and credibility with people over time?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not the greatest sort of at self psychoanalysis, but I would say that I obviously impressed people that I had a lot of ability. Plainly, I mean, I'd still find it amazing that Kerry would have put all of his legal affairs in the hands of a 28-year-old lawyer. But he'd known me for some years and he had a high regard for me. And he certainly trusted me in the sense that he knew that if I, told him that, X was X, it would be, that would be right. If he knew I was not he knew that I was reliable in terms of the facts and not inclined to, gild the lily exaggerate. And that's a real issue. There are a lot of people in business. I'll just come back to Kerry in a second, but a lot of people in business who are great business people are salesmen, and so they believe in what they're doing, and they will spruik it and talk about it in the most passionate way. And sometimes the risk is that they will, as they say, believe their own bullshit. And you've got to sort of be very careful that your own, if you are the salesperson, that your own enthusiasm doesn't lead you into imagining prospects that don't exist, or particularly imagining numbers that don't exist. And so how do you've got to maintain, to be effective, you've got to maintain the extraordinary, charismatic, evangelical enthusiasm of the advocate salesman on the one hand, but then in another part of your brain have the hard-headed analytical skills of the penny pinching CFO, that you actually know, if you are going to run out of money, when you're going to run out of money. And, sometimes if you're the, if you're the shareholder, or you're the chairman or whatever, you might make sure that you've got, two people doing that. So a good, very hard-headed CFO and and the more charismatic CEO. But just getting back to people, I think it was interesting. I mean, Packer did put that faith in me then, but it worked out to be the right call. I mean, quite frankly, he would not have. I mean, as I say in the book, Donald Trump always used to joke, that. I used to say, Malcolm's the best lawyer in the world. He kept my friend Kerry Packer out of jail. Well, I think Kerry came very close to being charged. There's no doubt about that. But I think the decision not to prosecute him was correct, and I think if he had been charged, he would have been acquitted. But having said that, I think had we not taken the approach that I recommended and that we took, I think he would have been out of business anyway, because the reputational damage, if had we not stepped up and basically destroyed the reputation of the Costigan Commission, they would have destroyed his, and he would have had his banks were getting ready to call his loans in. His licenses, broadcasting licenses in those days, were subject to being a fit and proper person. I mean, he was in diabolical trouble. He could see the whole, empire just, dissolving. Which is why, as I describe in the book, was why he came. Well, he certainly talked about taking his own life, in order to sort of remove himself as the problem. Really, it was a very, very bleak period. But hiring the 28-year-old lawyer was a good move, as it turned out, reckless though it may have appeared at the time.
Again, you just touched on something else that I wanted to speak to you about. Running a company can be extremely isolating, and so much of a founder's identity can be tied down to their business, and as a result, the success and failure of that. One of the things that you were extremely open about in the book was some of your own struggles with mental health. And I read a stat recently as well that founders are twice as likely as average citizen to suffer from mental health as well, kind of over the course of their lifetime. You mentioned a couple of things in the book repeatedly in terms of your journaling and using that to help clear your thoughts. Again, just wondering if there's any, I know that there's no sort of one-size-fits-all solution, but do you have any advice to founders who are potentially experiencing something similar, especially given the time period that we're going through, in terms of some of the mechanisms that helped you, or how founders can seek help with this particular area?
Well, I think the most important thing that I learned and I'd commend that chapter of the book to anyone who's interested in this. But I would say the most important thing I learned was that if you have a vulnerability to depression, if you recognize that, and most people do, in my view, that's my untutored anecdotal opinion, but most people do. If you do, you've got to be very alert to when it is creeping up on you. And pay as much attention to your mental health as you do to your physical health. I mean, we were joking about denying that your pants are too tight because you've been eating too much. If you just realize that you can't get your jeans done up, generally, if you're sensible, you'll eat a bit less, do some more exercise, and get trim again. On the other hand, all too often when we're feeling glum, we don't do anything about that. Now, if you are feeling glum, if you're starting to get depressed, counteract it. There are lots of strategies. I mean, the simplest one is just to get outside and enjoy some sunshine. But whether it's counting your blessings or and when I say counting your blessings, I'm not being preachy here, but you've got to, the misfortunes you have in your business may, pale into insignificance compared to the good fortune you have with being alive, being young, being healthy, having a family, all of those things. And I think but you got to be. Depression can ambush you if you're not alert to it. And until I got really sick, I had not been, frankly, alert to I had not been aware of mental health, of my own mental health, even though I had been, up and down at different times, as I suppose we all have been, but I just wasn't conscious of it. And what that terrifying episode that I describe in the book, what that taught me was that you've got to be really alert to it. As I say, as alert to it as you are to your physical health. It's just as important.
Yeah, and sometimes those people that are closest around you might be able to identify those patterns when it might not be as evident to you as well.
Yeah, that's right. And so obviously you've got to be tactful about this, but that movement, are you okay? You would have seen the badges, that people sometimes wear. That's a very valuable thing to do. Be alert to how people around you are, and as tactfully as you can, say, are you okay? How you going? You seem a bit down. Do you want to have a talk about it? Because you cannot address a problem unless you recognize that you have a problem. And I think the truth is the brain is probably the part of us that we understand the least. You're so much better off being able to manage problems like this yourself, I think, than in the early stages, rather than getting into the point where you need serious medical intervention.
Shifting gears, we touched on your experience with Aussie Mail a little bit earlier. I think your investment in the company of $500,000 that resulted in a $57 million exit is relatively well known now, especially over the last few years as well. You touched on this a little bit earlier. You were really struggling to raise any money on the financial market. I'm curious to know from your perspective, at a time when it was fairly unfashionable to do so in terms of investing into tech, what were some of the things that initially got you interested in investing, and what was it specifically around Aussie Mail that made you want to join the company as an investor?
Well, I always thought Sean Howard was a really inspiring, brilliant guy. So I was very impressed with him. And I guess I could see the sort of inevitability of it. Inevitability is not the right word, right? Nothing's inevitable really, except death and taxes. But I could see the trend and the the challenge was always going to be practical things, like securing enough bandwidth. I mean, these were the early days. These were the early days when we had dial-up internet access, before we had moved to DSL. I mean, it seems, when you think of, when you think of the days when accessing the internet involved a 14.4 kilobit per second connection over a telephone line. I mean, and that's, that seems just inconceivable, but it's not, for me, it's not so long ago. Our daughter Daisy is a school teacher, and she, some few years ago, she got me to come along and talk to some of her girls. She teaches at a girls' high school, and so all these teenage girls, and we were talking about the media, and I was describing, the making the point about classifieds that I made earlier. And as I was talking about people wading through vast piles of newsprint to read classifieds, some of them were rolling their eyes. You could see that. I think they honestly thought I was making it up, or that I was talking about, I don't know, the days before the printing press or something like that. So it is a lot of those practical challenges that we faced in the early days seem unreal today, but they were very real. Just getting enough bandwidth across the Pacific was a huge issue. Grappling with Telstra, that was a hell of an issue. Telstra. I've always said its approach to competition was like that of a First World War general who knows that he has to retreat, but is going to do so as slowly and at as great a cost to the enemy as he possibly can.
Shifting on from that, the world looks very different now than, I guess, when you first made that investment into Aussie Mail, and you obviously had your experience, in public office as well. Really curious to know, I guess, over that time, and especially given the exposure that you would have had to the global market, and I guess some of the larger challenges that we face. How has that perspective or kind of experience, or the shift in technology, shifted the way that you look at investments? And are there particular areas or themes or verticals that you're personally really interested in sort of exploring further as investment opportunities?
Well, I'm back investing as a venture capitalist. My focus is on, but not exclusively on, Australian technology, Australian innovation. So we've made a few investments in recent times, which have been public, in Myriota, the Adelaide-based small satellite company, swarm satellite company. Advanced Navigation, really an outstanding Australian business, with sort of essentially virtualized gyroscopes that enables navigation without, in radio silence. What else? Safety Culture, Luke Annear's company, Safety Culture. And there's a number of others that are yet to be announced. But I would say I'm very, very interested in cybersecurity. I mean, I think that's an area where there is really developing expertise in Australia, and that was in part the product of government policy. My connected to the National Innovation and Science Agenda was our first national cybersecurity strategy, and all of the institutions that we set up associated with that are there to, like AusCyber and so forth, are there to support innovation in that area. So we've got a lot of local Australian expertise. So I think that's that's always going to be a very lively area, because frankly the innovation of the people trying to disrupt your security online is going to drive and demand innovation from people seeking to protect it. I don't see that dynamic changing.
So I know that we've got a lot of questions coming in through the Q&A tab, as well as a bunch of questions that were delivered via the registration process. So last two questions from me before we shift gears and move into audience Q&A. So one is, it's a two-part question as well. So the first one being, obviously given the current situation around COVID and the pandemic, there are a lot of startups and businesses that have, faced an extremely challenging time. I guess, especially considering this time, but more broadly, what role should the government play in supporting the startup ecosystem? And the second part of my question is, obviously there have been some measures over the last few years, such as the ESVCLP, that provides, particular tax incentives for capital gains and income gain tax for individuals to really spur the early stage startup investing ecosystem. And that's had a really big impact as well. If you had a magic wand, or if you had an ability to shape or create a policy, what would be some of the areas that you would focus on, and potentially what would that look like?
Well, I don't know if you'd call it a magic wand, but I certainly had the ability as Prime Minister to do just that. And that's the National Innovation and Science Agenda, which included a number of the measures you just mentioned, really was designed to do that. I think it's been very successful, the NISA, actually. I think, one of the things I found most gratifying is that people in the tech ecosystem have said to me, how important it was and how much it's contributed to the greater availability of capital for startups. Look, I think what you've got to do with policies like this, Rohit, is you've got to constantly review them. I said when I launched the NISA, someone said, do you guarantee all of these measures will work? And I said, no, I don't, much to the journalist's surprise. I said, some of them probably won't work. And if that's the case, we'll dump them. Some of them will do well, in which case we'll do more of them. And if we find somebody else addressing the same problems more effectively, we'll shamelessly plagiarize them. So that's the approach you've got to take. And I think really, it's probably now, we're by November, it'll be 5 years since the NISA was announced. So that would be a good time for a public review, maybe it's something the government could get started on now, to look at all of the innovation measures and see, which have worked, which we should do more of, etc. There is plenty of money out there, plenty of venture capital out there. I don't think there's a shortage of funding for Australian innovation. I'd be very interested to hear what your audience thinks, where like if we were just constituting that review now, what would we say are the things that government should be doing more of? I think what government should be doing more of, and they are, but there's a way to go still, they should be buying more Australian tech. There is a tendency, that old saying, no one got fired for buying IBM. There is a tendency which came close to not being the case over the the census failure. You may remember a few years back. I think that there is a real onus on governments to support Australian technology. You've obviously you've got free trade issues and all sorts of other issues associated with that. But all other things being equal, we should do more we should try to engage with smaller Australian companies more than governments do. I've had some experiences with this, with businesses of our own long before I was in politics, and often the least patriotic parts of the procurement ecosystem in Australia is that belonging to government, because they prefer, they feel more comfortable dealing with big multinationals. So I'm a great believer in promoting Australian innovation and Australian technology in every way. The whole defence industry plan is designed to do that. But it's that's that you've got to have a view as to where you want to get to, and the goal is nothing worse than a roadmap without a destination, and the destination should be a very vibrant, sustainable, enduring Australian tech sector. That's what that's what you want, which has everything from big mega companies to healthy, lively startups. Now, we've come a long way. If you think about it, there are some big Australian tech companies. I mean, Atlassian's would be the biggest, but we do have quite a number of unicorns now, which would have seemed almost inconceivable, a decade, let alone 2 decades ago. But there's further to do. But the goal should be to ensure that we have our own tech sector. I'll just conclude this little homily with one interesting observation. So Bibi Netanyahu was once, the Prime Minister of Israel, was once asked who really founded Israel's tech sector. And his answer was Charles de Gaulle, which sounds odd, but it was when the French imposed an embargo on arms sales to Israel many years ago. That drove the Israelis to recognize that they had to be even more self-reliant in terms of their own technology. Now, we're not in that situation, but it is just a reminder that there is a role for industry policy. There is a role for what the French call dirigisme. And you look at the absence of it in many countries, say in the United States. I mean, you think about it, whatever your views are on geopolitics, it is kind of crazy that if you are looking to buy, if you're a telco and you want to move to 5G, there is not an American vendor that can deliver you a soup to nuts solution. You've basically got 2 Chinese vendors and 2 Scandinavian vendors, the Huawei and ZTE on the one hand, and Ericsson and Nokia on the other, and maybe Samsung is becoming the 5th, but then there isn't an American player there. And so and this is again is one of the topics I explore in the book. So the Americans really, in the same absence of mind that the British allegedly acquired their empire, in an absence of mind, they allowed leadership in that vital enabling technology to move away from the US.
Fantastic. Malcolm, thank you so much for that. We're just going to shift over to audience Q&A. And as I mentioned, thank you to all of you that have submitted questions. We're going to do our best to get through as many as possible with the remaining time that we have. First question that I'm going to pick out is from Liam Shaw, who is the founder of Rapper and also someone I've known for quite some time. So Liam's question is, you've got a great quote from Sam Chisholm in your book, who said to you that, Malcolm, we're both often wrong, but never in doubt. Is this a characteristic that you look for in entrepreneurs? If so, what other characteristics do you think are core to a good entrepreneur?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Liam. I think I was in more doubt than Sam. Sam was never in doubt. But look, I think entrepreneurs have to be very confident, but it's also you don't want to be in a situation where you've drunk excessively of your own Kool-Aid. So you've got to be realistic as well. It's a balance. Chisholm was he's no longer with us, sadly, but he was quite a character, one of the most colourful people I knew in my life, and a great sort of mentor and friend to me over the years.
Next question is from Chris Titley, who wants to know, you mentioned timing, the importance of timing a little bit earlier. And his question is, do you think you were ahead of your time with the innovation agenda and appointment of people like White Roy for the startup ecosystem? Or do you think the mainstream Australian public perhaps is ready for rapid innovation and changes in general?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I don't think I was ahead of my time. I think if anything, it was overdue. But I do agree there is a problem with the political saleability of innovation. I mean, it is a challenging because you have so much negativity in the Australian political discourse, particularly in the political media, that is built around basically frightening people and taking advantage of their anxieties. And the truth is that yes, innovation does result in changes, and that may result in changes that don't suit you. But you know what? Those changes are coming anyway. So the message you've got to get across, which is what I sought to do, was that we've got to make volatility our friend, because we can't change the tenor of our times. I mean, no government can. You can't change the disruption that's coming from technology, and certainly Australia can't. So what you've got to do is work out how you best harness that and make sure that, you're on the front of the wave, riding into the beach, as opposed to, being dumped by it.
The next question comes from my boss. And it's something that we've been discussing a little bit internally, but really curious to know what your views are on this. Where would you like to see Australia build up innovation and startup capability, and which technologies and or industries in particular, and why?
Well, I think there are, as I said earlier, I do think there's a role for industry policy and a bit of dirigisme, but you've got to be careful too, because a lot of this will depend on particular individuals, in terms of areas of, expertise. I mean, there is no reason why Atlassian, for example, ought to have been started in Australia as opposed to somewhere else. It was because of the individuals involved. So I think you've got to have a policy environment that encourages innovation per se, but there are clearly areas where we have the ability to spin off, tech off existing strengths. So I would say water management, I'm talking about agricultural particular. So water, natural resources, mining, hydro, pumped hydro, with the Snowy scheme. We are going to have the biggest, newest, obviously, pumped hydro scheme in the Southern Hemisphere. I hope there is a lot of people who learn a lot about that in the process and are then able to market that internationally. Clearly, everything to do with agriculture. I mean, we're advanced in that area compared to many other companies. And then, of course, the whole defence sector. Now, we don't have a natural advantage there. I mean, most countries have got a defence industry sector of some kind. But what we do have, because we are building so much of this capability in Australia, we will have a lot of very smart technology spinning off that. And I mentioned cyber earlier. That's a good example. So I guess you've just got but what you've really got to do is it's encouragement. I mean, the NISA had 25 measures, right? And they range from changing the law on insolvency, corporate insolvency, to, setting up the fund that is now managed by Main Sequence Ventures for the CSIRO. And, we talked about the ESVCLP and, the whole, the stack of them, right? But in many ways, I think the most important thing about the NISA was that the Prime Minister was talking about innovation and talking about it all the time. And I think using that megaphone or bully pulpit of government to talk up the importance of innovation is very valuable. Now, that's not happening any longer, which I think is a pity, but the momentum is already there. So, it's great. I know you work, I'm not here to do an ad for your employer, but I know you're working with Amazon in this, promoting and assisting startups. That's obviously good for Amazon's business, but it's also, vitally important that everyone, whether they're in government or in the corporate world, do what they can to encourage innovation. It's literally the extent to which we are innovative will determine whether we remain a prosperous first world, high wage, generous social welfare net economy. Because innovation is the key to productivity, and productivity is the key to economic growth.
The next question that I'm going to pick out is actually from my sister, who I think would kill me if I didn't pick her question for this process. But her question is: do startups have a responsibility to ensure their successes do not have unintended negative consequences in the future? For example, although the proliferation of rooftop solar PV is great, it creates a waste stream that we don't seem to be appropriately prepared for. How do you balance feedback loops?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is we've all got to take some, all got to be socially responsible. And in terms of the waste stream of solar panels, that's just something that's got to be managed. I mean, as solar panels, get old and get replaced, we've got to make sure we're not just throwing them into landfill. So, but that's true with a lot of tech waste. So I think your sister's absolutely right. But the answer is we've got to make sure that waste is treated, recycled, etc.
Last two questions before we sign off. The first one, and you just mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of utilizing the megaphone that you had in your position to really push it, which isn't currently happening. So the next question is from Diane Forster, who wants to know, what can you do to get the government to take a more bigger picture approach to problem solving?
Well, I'm not as influential as I used to be. I think politicians pay attention to public, what they pay attention to the media and public discourse. I mean, I'm out of politics. I'm out of politics in the sense I'm out of parliamentary politics. But I'll keep talking about these issues and writing about issues of this kind, and that will have some influence. But ultimately, what moves politicians is how people vote. And so the opportunity really is for political parties and political candidates to frame the policies that the public will see will ensure strong economic growth, and persuade people to vote for them. It's like climate policy is the classic example. People said to me, what would get the sort of reactionary right of the coalition to take a rational approach to climate change? Well, I mean, apart from the Murdoch press changing its view on this, which I think would have a really instant impact, the biggest impact would be electoral consequences. So, that's ultimately what most politicians spend most of their time thinking about, is how to get re-elected. That is the reality.
And final question, and I also wanted to give a shout out to the person who submitted this question, Attila Bogoda, who has done a great job in trying to help grow the startup ecosystem across the country through the Silicon Beach organization. His question specifically is around what can we do to propel Australia up the startup national rankings? We're number 7 in 2020, but I guess more broadly, how do you think that Australia should or could compete on a global level?
Well, I think we do compete on a global level. The question is, what do we need to, climb up that ranking? I'm not sure how those rankings are determined, by the way. So, a friend of mine who's very heavily involved in the startup scene, both here and in the US and in Israel, was telling me the other day that he thought our ecosystem here, our startup tech ecosystem here, was comparable to Israel's now. So, which I found surprising, but he would have a far better insight into that than me. So I think we're doing pretty well, but there's no room for complacency. I think any good policy ideas we should be, surfacing and getting on the table. I mean, I don't think there is anyone. Okay, let me give you the political analysis. I don't think there's anyone in Canberra today who is against innovation or against tech. Okay, I don't think so. There is a sort of climate denialist group that have got this particular obsession about coal and have turned what should be a question of physics into one of identity. But putting that aside, I don't think there's anyone in the cabinet that would say, I don't want to see innovation or I don't want to encourage Australian technology. The question is, there's two problems. So the first one is, how do you do it? What are the policies that are going to work? And that's where I think you've just got to look at what we've done, assess how it's performed, and then make appropriate changes. And of course, pay close attention to what's happening internationally. And I think the other point I'd say is that you really need to address this political problem that innovation to us sounds like a great idea, but to a lot of people it means a computer's going to take my job. So you've got to find a way of explaining that yes, there will be changes in the the jobs will, as technology changes, jobs will go, but more jobs will be created. I mean, there are, you've got to be able to make the case and just say, well, we all remember when there were conductors on every tram and bus. Well, there aren't today, but there's a hell of a lot more people employed. There was, and you can go through that. So the critical thing is, and see, the problem is, if you don't have a culture of innovation, then what's going to happen is technology will replace those jobs anyway, and you won't have the new ones to take their place.
On that note, Malcolm, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and insights. That's been fantastic. And obviously, thank you to all of you for getting up and tuning in. I'm sure that all of you have a full day of Zoom calls ahead of you. So thank you for adding us to your list this morning. Just a quick note from me before we sign off. This is part of a weekly series and new format of the show where we go live at 8 a.m. every Tuesday. Malcolm is obviously an extremely tough guest to follow, but next week we are joined by Sam Wood, who is the founder of 28 by Sam Wood, the #1 fitness app in the country, with over 350,000 users around the world, helping them stay fit during COVID. So Malcolm, once again, thank you for coming onto the show today, and thank you all for listening, and we'll hopefully see you all next week.
Thanks a lot, Rohit. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to episode 114 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back at 9 a.m. next Tuesday, the 9th of June, for another live episode of the show, and my guest for episode 115 is Sam Wood, the founder of the #1 at-home fitness app, 28 by Sam Wood, that has helped over 350,000 people around the world stay fit and healthy during COVID. I'm really excited about that interview and hope that you can join us. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.